Hello, I'm Jie.
I'm Zibo.
Our presentation will include a brief introduction about Praxis, an architectural journal started by Amanda and her partner, and a short summary of her lecture about the last issue of Praxis, which is about bad architecture. And we will also have a conversation based on the content of this last issue within the context of the journal. Praxis is a unique journal as it focuses on practice and theory equally, while other publications in America either represent architecture through theoretical tests or describing building projects in very simple ways. This is also the exact context that Amanda and her partner were in when they started to think about journal as a way of architectural practice to exploit this relationship. As she said, architectural writing and building were presented as independent when we understood them as co-independent. When the journal began, it was defined by these 5 basic questions, which mainly focus on building linkage between practice and theory, identifying similarities and differences among American architecture and architects, also on changes in various fields having impacts on contemporary architecture. These questions form a dialogical framework which implies a process of two-way exchange that makes the journal a means not only to answer questions, but also to create them through dialogues. There is a conviction that the connection between academic and professional cultures already exists, and the position of Praxis is to place a platform to publish the proof of this existence. However, the architectural working mode of the editors of Praxis implies that they are creating or at least reinforcing these proofs rather than simply placing them. And in order to reinforce the connection and also to set a rule for choosing projects, the journal is organized in a thematic mode. We can see through these 40 covers of Praxis which shows the themes or issues that each one focused on. For example, landscape, Mexico City, expanding service. The issues range from common urban issues to techniques. Apparently, Praxis is not building any connections between these issues, though they are all emerged from trends in contemporary architectural field. The aim is to set a context which allows the editors, architects, writers to make dialogues in case to create and reinforce the connections among these chosen projects, and a connection between practice and theory. Practice is the architectural practice of Amanda and Ashley. The organizational structure, according to them, is set up like an architectural office. In a word, the editors work on the journal just the same as architects work on building. Through all these frameworks and issues, Praxis is able to address to its initial questions while thinking to ask many more in the field of architecture instead of producing answers, as a way to make a case for ourselves or to transform or produce narratives of architecture.
So in the lecture, Amanda introduced their last issue, Bad Architecture. She makes it clear in the beginning that bad in the case of bad architecture does not have any negative connotation. Rather, the issue exploits the potential of being bad in an era in which architecture seemed to be trapped by its desire to do good. Architects that strives to achieve rationalization and to optimization. This lecture and issue serves to question that point of view by organizing its discourse around 2 main questions. What does it mean to be bad? And is there any value in badness in architecture? It is evident that both Amanda and the team of editors in Praxis agree that bad is useful and productive in architectural discourse, that it enables architects to critique, to reject, to reimagine, or even to call for revolution in architecture. But its meaning and context are debatable. In the lecture, a series of short texts, drawings, and photos are skimmed through in order to demonstrate cases of the architecturally bad and incorrect. The goal was not to criticize the work they have done as examples of bad architecture, but to use them to generate discourse around the current architectural practice.
So, although it seems that they, as Amanda mentioned in her lecture, chose the projects for this last issue randomly, it is clear that they have some certain standards for determining bad architecture. So what are the characters that make these architectures or architecture design bad ones in this journal? For instance, a bad form?
Yes, form is certainly a common characteristic many have discussed about regarding bad architectures. It ranges from the early formalism, such as building that follows a rigorous rule set but neglected function or performance, to postmodernism with buildings that have excessive and meaningless ornament, to at the other end of spectrum of geometric and parametric formalism, with building or architectural design that has poor or little consideration to occupation and scale. Though not all of the building that falls in these categories are necessarily bad architecture, many of them are certainly being criticized by certain architecture critics for its formal expression. But if we go back to standards for determining bad architecture, as you have mentioned, there are many more categories that we could consider besides form. First of all, a failure may be considered bad in architecture. On the one hand, structural or performance failures, or on the other, social failures such as the infamous case of Prutt-Eigel. Secondly, sameness may be considered bad in which it results in a mass group of building that lacks identity and diversity. Thirdly, unoriginal might be considered bad as it replicates others' intellectual property. And lastly, radical might be considered bad in which it is often unconventional and out of context. But I want to emphasize that badness is objective to each person. Therefore, a project is labeled bad for one person does not mean it is bad for everyone.
Yes, just as we saw in class 96, another critical architectural journal, architects seem to have a lot of ideas about what is a good architecture and what is a bad one. Actually, those definitions vary from very conceptual ideas like forms and design methods to very practical ones, such as practical impact of architecture. I think we could say that form and context with which praxis has used to define most bad architectures are very core issues in academic world of architecture. And since praxis has provided a context for us to discuss both the academy and praxis, I guess it would be important to consider those practical factors. In fact, as I believe architecture, whether physical or non-physical, is always a political statement, it is important to consider its political impact. And also, building is an extremely complex object that heavily relies on engineering and other techniques beyond architecture. Therefore, determining a bad architecture usually need to consider all these facts rather than merely look at those core architectural issues. Yet, if we do so, it seems like we are sort of losing architectural autonomy, since architecture relies so much on other disciplines. And in fact, this is one of the core topics in most of argument lectures.
Yes, this is absolutely true. Definitely politics and engineering, like you have mentioned. But also, there are other disciplines like biology, sociology, economics, and media studies that have influenced architecture greatly. Since architectural thinking and practice is capable of engendering far-reaching concept and discourse, there is always a natural tendency for architecture to grasp onto other knowledge in order to expand on what we have known already, and therefore a tendency to lose architecture autonomy. In addition, with increased sophistication of architecture as a field, it is more likely for architecture to import and export knowledge from other disciplines. And as a result, architecture as a discipline is destabilized and divided by other disciplines. The topic of autonomy is also a central theme in Jose Araga's lecture, The Building. He argues that regardless of how many other agents we bring into focus, the building remains the necessary condition for a contribution to knowledge in architecture. So in a sense, architecture as a field is autonomous as long as the thinking and the theory manifests into a materialized building.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. But I would say that building is not the only vehicle that holds the core techniques or knowledge of architecture. As we have seen different formats of architectural thinking, like writing, journal, book, designs, and finally, of course, the buildings, I find the idea of producing knowledge of architecture that does not come from other fields, while the knowledge itself could project into other disciplines very interesting. which is introduced by Jose in his lecture. This implies that we, the architects, need to produce or find out knowledge of architecture itself. It is about specificity rather than autonomy. And through this process, we could maintain autonomy of the discipline, but we don't necessarily have to limit ourselves to a certain vehicle. And the core knowledge is the key.
I totally agree. I think coming back to Praxis as a journal founded on intention of providing a new platform for architectural discourse, it in fact reinforced the core knowledge of architecture by bridging the gap between the dichotomy of theory and practice. Borrowing Veronica Petit's word, architecture ultimately is about a chain of action and reaction. The books, journals, and monographs presented in argument courses are all mediums in which an architect or a group of architects act upon the topic in order to formulate a theory or argument. It then becomes a springboard that triggers architectural critics, practitioners, and as a student to react against their statement. It is an endless cycle that drives the progression of architecture as a discipline. And I think that within this context, a good or successful architecture means a medium that synthesizes both building and theory equally, one that is capable of generating numerous reactions, and in the process, produce knowledge that advances architecture as a discipline.